Hi, everyone. My name is Joseph Carson, Chief Security Scientist here at Thycotic, and I'm really excited to bring you our latest show of 401 Access Denied. We have some fantastic guests for you today we're going to be really getting into discussing a very hot topic and something that, may have consequences for years to come. And I'm joined here with my awesome co-host of the show, Mike Roon. You want to give a little bit of update into yourself, how amazing you are in a new studio?
Yeah, thanks. So Mike Roon, VP of Engineering and CISO here at Cybrary. And today we have a couple of guests from our respective companies. I'll start with Jonathan Meyers. Jonathan, if you want to give a quick intro.
Hey, I'm Jonathan Meyers. I'm the principal infrastructure engineer here at Cybrary and also the head of IT. Glad to be here.
And our other guest, Terence.
Hi, my name is Terence Jackson, and I'm the Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer at Thycotic.
Awesome. And we're here to have a really intriguing discussion. We'll see where this goes today, but we're here to talk about SolarWinds and the Sunburst incident that happened going back into early December, where really basically when we started finding out was when FireEye disclosed that they had become the victim of a security incident. And for me, FireEye are one of the best in the industry of what they do. They have some awesome incident responders. They have amazing malware analysts. And for them to become a victim of an incident was quite, it's not never surprising because ultimately all companies will have security incidents. We will see them over time. But what was kind of surprising here was, how quick FireEye were to disclose it and announce it and, make it available. And through their investigation, of course, they found out that it became through a supply chain attack, ultimately kind of going back into SolarWinds. And as more information was made available, we started saying that this has the potential, for me, of being, one of the biggest software industry supply chain hacks to date in history, with over 18,000 initial victims that were, victims of that stage one campaign portion. And we'll get into some bit more details into really what happened in the background and give you the latest information we have today. I mean, as we're recording today in January, which is right now the 21st of January, this is where we're recording. Every day there's a new piece of information being made available to us. And I think already of this week, I think it was the fifth or sixth biggest piece of news announcements. And I always go back to, one of the people I respect in our industry, being Brad Smith, I've known for quite a number of years. He was the president of Microsoft. And he stated that this is probably a mass indiscriminate global assault on the industry that we've ever seen before. And he made that announcement at the CES Technology Trade Show a few weeks ago in the keynote. And I think this has many major consequences that we're seeing. And just kind of, for the audience or the co-host here, do you want to provide, some kind of your view of what you're saying? What's the potential, and what's the risk we're having here in regards to this latest, the incident that we're seeing? I'll pass over to Terence to give the first comment.
Sure. I've been saying for years, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And, SolarWinds is a very popular, network monitoring performance tool. Various companies from, your Fortune 100 companies to half of the federal government had SolarWinds deployed in their infrastructure. So, I think this attack was very methodical in and how it was executed and, exploiting weaknesses in the, software development pipeline. And, we always talk about in the industry, dwell time. There was massive dwell time around this. And it's, as you mentioned, new news comes out every day, every week. I think that's going to continually be the case for the remainder of this year because we don't know what other Trojans have been left behind or deployed that are just, kind of in a sit and wait state. But I think this was kind of a wake-up call for all of us security practitioners to, reiterate trust but verify, especially when it comes to our supply chains. Each of our companies relies on some type of cloud or SaaS-based infrastructure to operate. And, we can't control a lot of the underlying infrastructure in that. And, obviously SolarWinds pushed out an update and companies like, hey, we tell everybody to patch. But we just have to ensure, that we're doing at least as much due diligence as we can when we're, vetting and evaluating, new vendors. But also, security is a team sport. So I think this is also an opportunity for us to get tighter as a community and just help each other out when incidents like this, occur.
So SolarWinds are a friend in the industry. I mean, that's, we're all friends. We're all here to achieve the same goal. We're all here to make the world a safer place. We do get competitive. We, trying to sometimes compete with the same customers and so forth. But at the same time, our goal is to make the world a safer place in regards to the digital, place that we actually do our work in everyday lives. And for me, I think, SolarWinds and the customers of SolarWinds are not just the victims here. It's the entire software industry. This is the victim. I'd just like to get Jonathan and some of your insights or views and what your kind of thoughts and opinions are of the current incident to date.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. I think we've kind of started to see like murmurs, like bubbling of supply chain stuff kind of starting to happen in the industry, right? Like especially with a bunch of companies that use like the node frameworks and like those dependency tree hells, and starting to see like, I think this just kind of brought to light a lot of the stuff that people were kind of thinking that could happen. It's like, oh, well, we use these 12,000 dependencies in our UI app for Node. And it's like, well, what if one of those is compromised? And I think this is effectively that kind of on a much grander scale for the most part. But my kind of first take on a lot of this stuff is, how could you, I don't even know like how a company that's like has SolarWinds in there like could have prevented this, right? Like you would have trusted SolarWinds, like your due diligence is like, oh, it's SolarWinds, like cool, like let me see all your security creds. Like I don't know where you would have been able to like even start to think about like, how do I stop this? Especially like teams aren't just the largest teams ever that just have an entire body to throw at a software vendor for a week and be like, hey, let's check out the security update. But
Yeah,
like I also come from the government side of the house, and it's like I remember, installing software on CD-ROM drives and like scanning all of those and doing all of that type of stuff. And I still don't think that would have caught any of this, like doing manual scans of these packages. And so I think like what you said, like it's very much like an industry, like we're all on the same team. How can we start to like iterate on this faster and kind of predict these things and stuff like that? So
absolutely. I think this really needs an industry revolution to happen for us to all to come together and find out, analyze this as much depth as we possibly can. And really come together and find a way forward. Because for me, it's really, I've been in the patch management business for 20 years. And for me, it's broken our patch software update process. This whole incident has raised that to the surface. And if we kind of go back just into showing how sophisticated this was, and just going over what Terence had mentioned, it was really kind of like, this was a surgery that was very, very sophisticated, very well planned, very well executed. Even dating back, I mean, this has been several years in the planning. Only possibility of being either a nation state or a nation state backed group could have been really possible to pull this off. Where I always look at when I'm doing this response, I get into the motives and the intentions behind this, and there's many motives here. What we're seeing is there's financial motives that appears to be happening in the news today, that they're now selling parts of the source code off of the victims that they've had. So there seems to be financial participation here, intellectual property theft as well. You've got espionage, potential of pre-staging of preemptive attacks in the future. There's so many possible motives in the background here. It's really hard to really find out what was the true. I always find that there's always one true motive, and I think we're really getting to a point where that hasn't really come to the surface yet. When we get into looking at, to your point, Jonathan, I don't think anyone could have prevented this. I think you could have once you become a victim, you could react to it and you could see it later if you have some controls in place. But stopping it from happening, we look at it. It goes back to, I think, the first domain registration of the C2 was back in 2018. Then you get into in 2019 that already getting access to the build repo in SolarWinds and started just analyzing intelligently, gathering information about how SolarWinds actually develop and build and compile code. Just watching and learning and perfecting it, to the point is that when they eventually actually put Trojan in place in the malware, it was actually to the point where it actually looked like SolarWinds code. It actually, to a developer looking at that, would not have been able to tell the difference. And then, of course, getting digitally signed and actually making sure it was done in runtime during only the compilation process. And then ultimately, like most companies, once you get that signed build, you want companies to update it. And it was IT who downloaded it into those companies and distributed it to the servers. It was IT that was actually in the process of that, and sitting for 12 to 14 days of doing nothing. Trying to stay obfuscation, staying hidden. This was stealthy in design. So for me, it was done to basically very detailed surgery. This has been years in the planning, and potentially probably using some of the blueprints of previous attacks, whether it being coming off the back of Stuxnet or some of the things that we saw in the not Petchatime. Of course, that was a software update attack as well. And even going back into, I think it was 2004 Olympics, where it was in Greece or somewhere around that time, where they also used a supply chain attack in the Siemens equipment. For me, this has probably taken a lot of what we've seen over the years, but really perfected it. So, Mike, it just kind of, when you're listening to that perspective and, you being involved in a lot of software development, how could companies really kind of respond to that?
Well, before I get into that, I think just sort of some things that I thought were really interesting about the attack overall, and sort of from that software engineering perspective, right? They didn't just go straight to it, right? They did a test. They did test runs, made sure they'd be able to fly under the radar. I think, and happy to be told I'm wrong, but I think we might be giving them a little bit too much credit with regard to how much time they've been planning this specific attack. I think if I was doing this type of activity, I would have hundreds of command and control domains registered that I'd be registering well in advance of maybe ever needing them, just so that they're there. The DNS records are there. They've been sitting there for years, dormant, just waiting for, hey, I finally found a vector. What do I have in my, what can I use to that I've already sort of set up? So, and I think that, like, from a motive perspective, as you said, there's so many possible motivations that I think if I was an attacker, like any of those like if I'm a nation state, right, I probably have all of those motivations. And so I don't know that we can sort of focus in on what was the specific one. I think it was, hey, let's try and let's go for the broadest attack that we can, or find a target that gives us the most opportunity. I mean, that's sort of how I would go about doing this. And so I think when you're looking at why SolarWinds and it's like, well, obviously they're a great target because from there, they're a great launching pad into so much collateral, what we said was collateral damage, whether it was Microsoft or whomever, you just get to hop and skip and jump from there into so many other places.
Yeah. And just kind of to your point, Mike, I think you mentioned an important piece there. And for me is that, we all have to be looking for these attacks in our environments. We have to be proactively right now looking. And even if you're not a customer of SolarWinds, you should be concerned and looking for this, because what we're finding is that you might be a customer of SolarWinds. And this flows down. This is a domino effect, is that, if the supplier of you is a customer who you're dealing with, and that might be a cloud customer, it might be a SaaS-based customer, you should be concerned, and you should be actually proactively looking to make sure that you're not a secondary victim or even a third victim of this, because this has the consequences, because, we're all interconnected. We're all an industry, that, many companies out there have so many vendors, and the vendors they deal with are also working with many vendors. So this is all a massive interconnected web of different suppliers and third parties and source code and libraries that, the consequence of this is, potentially everyone could be a victim at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the web of this is interesting, right? Because even if you're not a SolarWinds customer, let's just take the Microsoft route, right? Microsoft was impacted. Who doesn't have someone in their supply chain? Even if we're not directly using Microsoft, which we're not, there's no one in our supply chain. Like, there's no way that Microsoft is not involved somehow in something that we do. And so I think that the potential is almost every tech company is impacted by this, and any company that uses technology.
Yeah, Terence, I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well. Microsoft being collateral damage here is in your kind of thoughts.
Yeah, a couple of things. The low and slow approach that this attack took should be, something that we really pay attention to, because if you look at the victims that we know about in that 18,000 number, FireEye being one, these guys have some of the most sophisticated tools, technology, smart people, and they missed it. So from that perspective, I think there are some areas of opportunities for the industry on where we can all improve. ML, AI, we for the last 5, 6, 7 years, next gen this, and to my knowledge, all of that failed. I mean, all of it failed.
Well, that's one you should listen to one of our other episodes.
So I think, and just pivoting back to Microsoft. Microsoft's been kind of all over this since early on, and some of the things that they did by revoking domains and getting those seized and taken down, and pushing out IOCs to their customers that were using their endpoint security products, I think is a good model of security being a team sport, and them making the intel readily available to their customers. And even to the point now, they're enabling certain features by default to help customers better protect their environments. And I think that's a model that, as an industry, being the CISO of a product, the cybersecurity product company, that we can all do better and being more responsible and enabling our customers to respond to threats, not if, but when they happen. But yeah, I absolutely think Microsoft was collateral damage. I think that, they ended up in a bunch of environments that were using, Office 365, and they had SAML and MFA configured, and they would, they got curious, and they were like, oh, this actually worked. And they waited. It worked again. And then they kind of did that. Who am I? Where am I? Okay, is Office 365 in play? Let's go forth. And, they bypassed, this is not a knock on any MFA vendor, but, Duo and others. But if they were using SAML off and tokens, it was kind of like game over. So
single sign-on out the window. It's a single sign-on of the attacker. That's what you're looking at. So
exactly. So I think there are a lot of takeaways for us as security practitioners to look at. And, obviously when this happened, everybody, board and, all the execs and everybody got the same question, are we a SolarWinds customer? And how secure are we? And, I think everybody is going through that process of reevaluating controls and looking at intel that's available. FireEye's done a very good job and releasing reports. They released one yesterday, as well as Microsoft. But, threat intel, I believe, is becoming more important to be incorporated into our security programs. I've seen a fair amount of email traffic from threat intel vendors nowadays, and making that a part of your program, which we already had. But I think it's a pivot point for the industry. The people, process, and technologies. I think we've gotten processes down. The people problem we're solving, but the tech is not a magic bullet in any stretch of the imagination. And I think this kind of turned that theory upside down. That what if your security vendor or the tools that you use to monitor the status of your environment gets compromised? What happens then? So, and unfortunately, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to that, but it definitely involves all three of the people, process, and technology.
Absolutely. I just want to bring Jonathan in two kind of areas for you. I'd like to get your thoughts on. Is one, since this did compromise SAML token forgery, which is a big concern for me, because it does allow not only the attacker to basically gain access to the victim's own infrastructure, but also pivot so many different areas, whether it being into cloud applications, hosting applications, SaaS, anything that basically organizations have really put in their service provider in regards to their single sign-on. And the second part of that as well is that this did leverage a digital certificate. How do we trust digital certificates going? Can we trust digital certificates going forward? So I'd like to get your thoughts on that and those two items, and anything else that's on your mind as well.
Yeah. So what's interesting, I don't know if this has been confirmed or denied, but some of the reports coming out of FireEye was how they originally caught it. And one of them is these guys requested a multi-factor token and it triggered an alarm because there was no employee that was like in their system that had been assigned this token.
Mhm.
And so I would say that like tokens did do some sort of like slowing down, right? Because like once they had that, I think if they had that full token that was authorized, I think it'd been game over.
Yeah.
And so I think that's pretty interesting, but like that's weird. And I think the way that got caught was still like a human that sat there and said, wait, like, right? Because like if somebody wasn't monitoring that and it just sat there in like the unassigned bucket, you know, and was still authorized, I think that's a very, very interesting sort of play. And then back into like the SAML stuff. I think that's like it's like a weird problem to solve for, because it's just like, oh, they have the keys to your house, right? Like it's like, how do I do this? Like it starts to go back that I think we're going to start, hopefully maybe as an idea is like you're migrating to this like person as an identity, and there's no longer, right? Like I think one of the weird things is, as like IT admins, you all have multiple sets of credentials that are like least privilege and things like that. And it's like, I think that starts to get in this like weird thing, because there's not like this one-to-one match between a person that works for your company and the permissions of the things they can do. And I think this kind of highlights that, is like, oh, there's a bunch of accounts out there that don't actually match to a human, and they're out there doing things in an environment. Like, how do we start to like ensure that it's like a one-to-one relationship? And I think things like physical security keys, where it's like you got to push a button physically that's like that lets you in. I think that starting to kind of implement those on much higher levels of access and things like that starts to get to that point. The certificate problem is a huge problem. I think we've slowly been moving that way, right? Like, I think certain things in the certificate world are starting to move that way. I think it's just very slow rolling, right? Like with the whole Let's Encrypt and the ability to like automatically generate certs and things like that. I think you can start to eliminate a lot of it if like that infrastructure kind of gets baked in. And so now you're turning certificates every like day or 12 hours or 6 hours. And there's a method to kind of ensure that like, as soon as a key has been deemed and compromised, that like there's a way to revoke it without breaking everything in the system and down the lines. And I think kind of getting to a point where we're kind of like rotating things a lot faster than we kind of thought about in the past is an interesting strategy kind of moving forward for that.
Yeah, but I think with the rotate, right, at some point there's still some key, there's something right up chain. Like you always have that like potential of like, well, okay, so these certificates are rotating all the time. It's like sort of going up the line, and I think that's where it gets trickier and trickier. And Joe and I have talked about things that people are good at and things that people are not good at, like when it comes to passwords and having an identity so that I don't have to put in a password, but it's more of a cert-based system. But then this sort of gets into almost the exact opposite of that. Like sometimes a human in the system is the thing that's going to pull the kill switch, because they can recognize this just doesn't make sense. Like this isn't right. Like what happened at FireEye, right? Like that's what ultimately happened. And I don't know, there's no amount of AI or ML that's gonna solve those problems. And ML and AI, that type of stuff, that'll find it after it's already released. That'll sort of see it in action and be like, oh, that looks unusual. But by that point, it would have already been too late again. So I don't know how we sort of deal with that.
I believe
training it, yeah.
Right, and to that point, AI and ML in its current iteration is nothing but models that have been trained. So
automation.
Exactly, it's automation. So it's that's why I was like, it kind of it is, but it isn't. But I'm curious of what your perspectives are on now, because it's the industry, for the last 10 plus years has been vulnerability management, patch. So now, what do we do? Are we?
I'm buying a 1970s car and moving to Montana. That's my solution.
That's the challenge, is it? Because we do software updates and security patches the exact same way. The process is exactly the same, and the delivery mechanism is exactly the same. And I worked on, I came up, I always have this fun terminology, is that, it used to be patch, when Microsoft released their patch Tuesday and it comes out, you would, test it Wednesday, pilot it on Thursday, roll it out Friday, and then you'd burst into tears on Saturday because it failed. and then you're using your Sunday for rolling back, and then you're testing it again on Monday, the new patch, and then you're rolling it out Tuesday, and then it's repeat. But we treat the software update, new feature functionality follows that same process and path, and it's the same signature to the same compilation process. And we want people to apply the software updates fast. We don't want them to delay because they're already exposed vulnerabilities.
You mean there's security updates? I mean,
updates, correct.
Well, and I think the reason, and it's funny because I'm putting like DevSecOps is all about like, let's treat our security updates the same way we treat our software updates in a lot of ways, right? Like if we want to shift software developers to being more responsive to security problems, then what we're doing is we're shifting those identifications and treating them just like any other bug, right? We shifted into the testing, into all sorts of things, in the CI/CD, into their IDE, so that like, hey, while you're fixing this other thing, here's a secure, update the dependency on this package that we use because there's a security update. There's really fundamentally, there's no difference between a security update and a bug fix, right? Like we can get into new features and new whatever, but fundamentally they're the same thing. And so I think we do want to continue to move them together. And from a like as someone who had to deal with like enterprise software releases, the more you can sort of put in the release, the better. You're not going to you can't expect a customer to like, and Jonathan knows because he was on the installing end of this, right? We had customers that were running the same things for months because they weren't interested in those new features or whatever. So you want to have, like for enterprise software, you want to have fewer releases. And so the more you can sort of bundle together to get those companies to update and upgrade is the right thing. And obviously security patches like, oh, this is a vulnerability that needs to be patched immediately falls outside of that. But I think that's where it's going to be a struggle.
Yeah, I think we really need, we talk about zero trust, and I hate the terminology zero trust. It's not my biggest, favorite term. I prefer looking at it from building trust because ultimately we want to establish a trust framework. So it's all about building trust. And for software update and patch security updates and all those processes, I'm concerned that right now, how can you trust the next update from another vendor? And how long do you need to test it? Do we need to have it, put in a sandbox now for 2 weeks, a month? How long do we have to delay that in order to be able to trust it? And this gets into that whole scenario is that what do we do? Do we need to get into having more controls and more validation and continuous verification over that process? Because right now, I think what we're going to start seeing is that the fallout of this incident. We're starting to see that Microsoft's now a victim and their source code is now exposed. We see Cisco's out there. Malwarebytes have just recently announced, and Symantec have now released their latest findings of both the malware teardrop and raindrop, which is also so there's been right now so many malware variants been involved in this particular incident that it gets to the point is it really kind of where do we go from here? All of those source codes has now been exposed. The attackers are probably now looking for vulnerabilities in those. Looking for exploits to be able, and then the update again is the same process is to download and update and patch. So we're in this kind of basically, mouse trap of, in a kind of continuous process. Where do we really need to evolve? Where do we need to get to? And I think this is where the industry needs to come together. This must be a collaboration effort for me because I think we're going down this repeat path again in order to solve the problem of yesterday.
I mean, I think risk is an important factor, right? So when I'm looking at it, like just forget about what we do to like moving forward, but what we do today, right? When we look at some new version or some update, I do look through it and sort of decide how important is it that we do this timely, right? And if it's a security patch, obviously it has a higher risk. The longer we wait, the more we're exposed. So obviously we need to rush this through, we need to not rush, but get this through faster. Mm-hmm. And things that are just feature function can take we can have a longer burn and we can make sure and we can test. So I think there needs to your point, and we started talking about this a little bit, was I think we need to potentially grade things or provide that risk profile so that I'm on the tail end. It's not like anybody's installing. Nobody depends on Cybrary's software, right? We are the leaf on the tree. We depend on everybody else leading up to us, right? And so when we go to make those decisions, what we need in order to decide whether or not we want to upgrade is like, what's the risk, what's the potential, and how much risk are we willing to take on for us and our customers. And so, yeah, security things are going to have a higher precedence than just features. We should be testing longer. And I think we need a better way of identifying that, communicating that as part of the patch process for automation. Because right now, we could totally automate, just update, like whenever there's a new version, just update and run it through some smoke tests or do whatever. And if the house doesn't burn down, let's just ship it and we'll deal, And so it needs to be built into the automation. There needs to be flags. There needs to be some way of indicating like a risk profile of some sort. I don't know. That's just my thoughts off the top of my head.
Yeah. And I like to kind of bring Terence and Jonathan. I got a question on your side as well, is that one of the things that, the original Sunburst malware software, it was saying there it had the backdoor. What was quite impressive about that is, of course, once the payload had been delivered and those stage 1 victims were started doing this enumeration phase of gathering things like, system information, credential details, the administrator SIDs, registry details. It started kind of doing that enumeration of what environment am I in. What was impressive is that this actually put itself into what was called an Orion improvement program. It masqueraded as telemetry type of data and then sending it back in through HTTP. And it used steganography. I always get confused. So hard to say that word properly. It's a tongue twister, but it hid itself in basically standard, data configuration information, and then through HTTP sent it off to the command and control, which was located in the US. So sometimes you when you're using threat intelligence, you see it going off into countries where you may not do business, and that's always a flag. Or you start seeing new traffic that's outside of what you should be monitoring. When your data has been stolen from you or information is being sent to command and control, what things do you see? What can we do there to prevent our data being taken out, and also to get that visibility over potential malicious network traffic?
It's a great question, man. One of the things I would say that we currently, my team currently does, we have rules in our SIM around spikes in encrypted traffic that's going out, and just anomalous activities around increases in network traffic overall. And this is one of the areas where I would say, ML or AI actually does help us, because it's able to evaluate that, looking at standard deviations over, an amount of time, and it does detect minute spikes that a human would otherwise ignore.
I mean, I would program just to butt in there, right? I would just program for that, right? I just go for a slow burn. If I know what the algorithms are, then I just go lower and slower. And your AI, your ML won't pick that up. It won't be a spike. It'll look like any other sort of system sort of naturally coming online. We'll just sort of have a slight increase.
Yeah, which is what happened here. And this, right, is that they masqueraded in telemetry data and also made it look authentic in HTTPs, and it was hidden in plain sight, which is the challenge here.
Right,
right. So. Well, to that point, we actually paired that with domains never seen before, which for both of you will probably be like, "Wow, that's probably way too noisy." But again, the solution that we have actually boils that down, right, and does a layer of analysis on that's actually curated by a human on the back end. So it's an outsourced service. But at the end of the day, if you're in the crosshairs of a nation state, it's basically, hold on and hope that you can detect it sooner rather than later, and you don't have a 9-month dwell time. But it's still back to a lot of the defense in depth approach. I call it like it's an onion, man. It's layers. There won't be a magic bullet, but I believe there are things you can do in your environment to detect things quicker. But like I say, if you have somebody determined and they're going low and slow, it's tough. I mean, I wish I had an answer, because I probably would go start another business. I don't. So, if you guys want to talk after this, I think there's a blockchain playing somewhere.
I think there's a lot of companies that are starting that seem to claim that they have a solution. They have the silver bullet, but as I don't remember who I quote on this, but there's no such thing as a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. Right. There's just lead bullets. Right. Yeah. So we just need enough lead bullets.
I mean, some instance there is, certain solutions or products that will actually prevent it. This one, however, because of the multiple techniques you use, if you go to the MITRE framework and you actually plug this into the MITRE framework, it's basically the whole framework is red. It's like they use every technique in the book here. So an organization trying to really prevent against that, you would have to have almost every solution that's available in the world today. And that's that value-wise and costly-wise, that's just not efficient and effective for business. So, same as yourself, Jonathan, since you're kind of over infrastructure, what things would you have been looking to in addition to what Terence had mentioned?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing that's there's a couple of companies that are kind of starting to come up, and you start to get these like reputation scores based on things. And I don't think there's that many vendors that kind of do it on domain names and traffic and things like that, where you start to get this like basically raising the flag on, first time domains been seen and things like that for an actual human to pick up. Like that's still, I think, super noisy. If you can start to tweak a lot of that type of things. And then I think the other thing goes back to maybe I'm just like old school and weird and I come from the government side of the house, but like everything is like segregated in networks, right? Like it's very different networks running very different rule engines. And so you have to be in, say, like for production instances and stuff like that, right? Like I don't know how we got away from this at some point, but like outbound traffic should not be allowed, right? Like you're putting in very specific names of what outbound traffic should be going outside of, the handshake that occurs back to the client. And so like, I think people forget about that now because they're like, oh, well, we have a firewall or like, we have some next gen thing. And it's like, well, cool. But like outbound traffic can still go talk to whoever it wants. And I think we kind of have gotten away from that. And then, like segregating out your different networks. Like if you have source code on a network, like that's a very different network than like your office where you're just sitting in there kind of doing normal browsing of the webs and things like that. And I think you can start to crank up these like rule engines on existing software to kind of be much more high alert when you start to see these things. And I think now we're at the space, I think logging and stuff like that's finally caught up to like a reasonable space where you can actually log every request, even if it's blocked. And like, instead of just like, I guess we used to do in the old days was just drop it, right? Like you would just drop it if it was blocked and you wouldn't have any insight to how many times you were blocking things outside of a little counter that would just tick up. You wouldn't see exactly what was blocked. But now we have this ability to kind of analyze that stuff. And then I think the next step is, this sounds scary, I guess, but like you got to not open source that, but like those logs have to feed into like a larger like threat landscape, right? And I think it has to be almost vendor agnostic, right? Like we can't have these silos of like, you're subscribed to this threat stream and that's where you contribute back your logs. And so only that threat stream is getting better and better, but like they refuse to collaborate with another smaller company that's got a threat stream. And I think we're missing all of that, right? Because the thing that strikes me the most about this attack was the patience, right? Like, I don't know if I could have ever had that patience, because if you think about like standard turnover for cyber employees at companies and things like that, this starts to like outgrow that, right? Like you're looking 2 to 3 years, maybe at smaller startups and things like that. And if this thing's been sitting there for 3-4 years, like you're now losing that every time an employee changes. And I think so we need to be, as a community, kind of better at sharing that type of stuff. So it's kind of available to everybody without, giving up, IP and stuff like that. But I think there's enough ways to like scrub logs and things like that, that you can start to kind of, buy into like this open community that shares threat streams and intels and things like that. I think that would be an interesting one of those new open source, like we're going to sell you services on top, where it's like our open source is we're going to host this logging platform that does all the analysis and stuff, and then we'll sell you services.
I mean, isn't that what the U.S. government, at some point, like the FBI or whomever has tried to do for U.S. companies, right? Is, hey, if we can sort of collaborate, you can trust us for the government.
Yeah. But they said that was one of the reasons this was such a blind eye is because the NSA is not allowed to spy on internal U.S. operations. And this was an internal U.S. operation.
Right.
And so we lost that our entire security world has been set up to watch stuff leaving the country as opposed to seeing the inner workings.
Yeah. And to your point, Jonathan, I think one of the things you get, a lot of the government is outsourced.
Right.
And that's the other side of it is that it's not just, basically government entities and agencies. There's so much third parties and outsourced components that the government is actually relying very much on the private industry right now. And I like your concept and theory, not only zero trust inbound, but also outbound. So,
well, and the irony is, right, as Jonathan was talking, like it struck me as like, yeah, it's ironic that we've gotten away from this, given the fact that it's so much easier to automate everything. API driven everything is like the way things are going. Everything is configurable. Infrastructures.
Look at Little Snitch. Right, Little Snitch. Do you want to allow this? Yeah. Like, why don't we have that for like production, like infrastructure? Like, oh, like this thing requested to go out. Do you want to allow it? Like, because Joe on his computer terminal wants to hit PGA.com, right? Like, oh, okay. Like that's a very easy.
Right.
But you can do reputational based analysis in that. Well, there's no one place you're going to. You can go and get threat intelligence and say, is this something that we know about? Because what was very unique, we go back into the C2, it was actually unique for every customer, every piece of malware. It actually created that unique, subdomain registration. So it was unique for all of those. So it wasn't this common thing. But I think your point.
But if you hashed it, like I think you could have done some math to been there's something that's generating this that's consistent. Right. And I think the only way you could have run that algorithm to learn that would have been if you had all of these.
And
visibility.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. It's a similar problem that we depend on a vendor. I'm not going to name names, but we depend on a vendor to do some things, and they run into that same problem where they only can see what they can see. They can only see traffic that they have control over, and they're not plugged into a broader thing. So when there was like a DDoS, their ability to recognize that is very limited because they can only see, but meanwhile, all those same IPs that are involved in that attack are also attacking other things. And if they were just plugged into a larger ecosystem, a larger player who can see more of the traffic across all of the internet, it's clear that those are bad IPs. But, and so they'd be able to respond faster. And I think that that's where we need to get to is a more shared understanding of these domains, these IPs, and reputation.
I think an interesting thing is where are the ISPs and the major like tier internet operators and all of this? Like where does their responsibility start?
Accountability.
Because they see all the traffic, right? Like there's the threat intel you need to plug into. Like I just need to plug into AT&T's NOC, and it'd probably be crazy how many things I'd find and predict and be able to stop. And it's weird that like AT&T doesn't sell this. Right, like,
or maybe they do, but we're just not
alien.
We're not their intended customer. We don't have a special court that allows us access to it. But Jonathan, I want to pick up on some of the things you said. I think definitely to your point is that this needs to be, and also Terence mentioned defense in depth and micro segmentation across your networks. You shouldn't have this open, basically all connected network, which I see all too common in many companies. Is that basically they have these everything's connected to the same network. There's no isolation. You get a domain administrator account that has access to everything. And go back to, I learned my lesson 20 years ago working in a data center that I should not have an account that has unfederated access to everything across the network. You should have an account that allows you real-time access just in time for the target system, and it should be segmented. This gets into even the kind of areas that should build repositories, even be internet connected. Should it even be possible to communicate to the internet? Should they be isolated, segmented? And it gets into the big question about even using things like Git repositories and shared resources. How do we deal with that going forward? I really like your kind of, what you mentioned about this segmentation, and definitely how do we do the defense in depth as Terence mentioned. But for me, it just, in some regards, it does seem to be overly complex. It'd be a great way to find, simplification of that.
It will, if I can add to that a little bit. So, Jonathan, great suggestion. About a year ago, that's exactly what we did. If servers don't touch the internet anymore, because we had seen interesting behaviors from, developers. No knock on developers, but if you're developing all day and you're, on a server and you're accessing multiple resources, are you gonna, come back to your local environment to go to PGA.com, or if you're on the server, hey, at Chrome or Internet Explorer or whatever is here, I'm just gonna watch it here. So we did and back to risk, we evaluated, is there a need for these servers to actually connect to the internet? And probably I would say 95% was like, no, they don't. We pull down updates to a centralized location and distribute them within the network. So that actually reduced our attack surface and the noise that we were getting, in our, SIM greatly. It didn't make a lot of people happy, but they adapted. That's a topic for another podcast. But it just really made everybody just look back and say, oh, well, I guess, servers, we really don't need to browse the internet from a production server. And why have we not done this before? But just to that point, it doesn't go anywhere. You can try, but it's like, nope. But we log the request, because sometimes that's an area to re-educate someone on, like, hey, we saw this come in. You're not in trouble, but
this is the reason we don't do that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How many times you log into the server and you see you're going, why is Chrome sitting here? Why is Adobe PDF reader on here? Someone installed Microsoft Office.
What's funny is, just going back to developers find a way. Like, I was at a place where my local machine was more locked down than the servers. So you better believe, I was like, oh, I need to read an article on such and such that I'm trying to work on, and I can't get there from my local machine because my local network's more locked down. I'll just go to the server and go out from there.
and then you find, you're looking at, on the server, and it's like, oh, the documentation's in a PDF. Okay, let me install Adobe. And then you find out, oh, it comes down. It's zipped.
No, you just run strings on the.
Let's stick 7-zip on it as well. so all of a sudden you find your servers get bloated with all these additional software that you don't really need on there, and now you have more software you need to patch as well. So, so absolutely, the more you lock them down, the more to harden them, and getting to, I'm really kind of a big fan of getting into principle of least privilege. Is that I should not, when I log on, one of the things in the data center that I kind of learned this process, we did it in separation of duties. And I realized that I should have the separation of duties within my credentials as well. And I should not have one credential logs into every server that has the same amount of rights. And I should always start with 0 and build up to what I need to be able to do. And it should not be under user context. It should always be under basically a delegated change control process. So for me, we need to get into really locking things down and preventing communication.
And I think temporal is an important part of that. Like, putting a temporal time, like the idea of, I have this role for a period of time. It's not me going into an admin account. It's me being provisioned an admin role for some period of time. And to, for really high risk things, maybe it is a 2-key system. Where Jonathan and I worked at Red Owl, where for a short period of time before Jonathan joined, we were actually more in a legal use case thing. So we had data that was under literal lock and key in a vault. And the way we handled that was the disk itself was encrypted, and only only a handful of people had access to the encryption key. And then there was only a handful of other people that knew the code to unlock the vault.
To change.
Right.
Yeah. So I've had the same, it happens in the gambling industry as well. When you get those the games machines, in order to provide an update on that, you've got the one key that unlocks it, and then you've got a second key which is change. Right. So that no one person, you've got that separation of duties. No one person can make the change. Same in ATMs have that same process. Is that when you go to do, that's why even when money's been transferred, that is all done in teams. Is that no one single person has the keys to the kingdom.
And I think we can do similar things, especially with automation, with regard to requesting, hey, Jonathan can see me requesting administrative access and be like, yeah, sure, I'm going to approve that. I know it's Mike or whatever. We were just slacking about it in some side channel or whatever it is. And so we can come up with a way where we can sort of give privilege in a way temporarily and still and not really in a way that makes it really difficult to get stuff done. At 2 a.m., I'm sure it's a different scenario.
Let me throw a wrench in that.
Yeah.
What if your security team is one person?
Well, right. I mean, that's a problem.
Or two people,
Then
right?
You get the cleaner to join you.
Yeah, like
Right.
it starts to be, it's like if you're the only security guy at, say, a smaller company, right? And you got like 4 devs, security guy, and then
Right.
like 12 other employees. Like, does the CEO have to approve it? Like,
or I
and
mean,
then-
the fact is, you can
Transparency.
have those other devs. Like, you can get into a role where you can delegate off the responsibility of confirming that Jonathan is Jonathan to almost anyone else in the company. Like anyone who can reasonably
Non-repudiation.
trust with that, right?
You're getting into non-repudiation. That process is that you have to make sure that your audit trail cannot be tampered with, so that you become truly accountable, and that somebody else can provide auditability into your actions. So if you are a single source of, that you need to do all of it, a one-person operation, then you need to make sure that your auditability is accountable, that you cannot hide your audit trail. So one thing is, I'd like to step back a bit and we kind of dive back into because I don't think we're going to solve the issue. I think we can just bring in, the problems and challenges.
Wait, what are we doing here if we're not solving it?
I think that's something that's outside of the podcast that we can solve.
No doubt.
Bring world peace in order. But at least, hopefully it is in the right direction. And hopefully this is a wake-up call for the industry. I just want to bring it back to some of the latest revelations that's come out this week. And what we recommend even for those victims right now, what things they can do as well in order to maybe, let's say, respond to this. So the first thing is, we've heard Malwarebytes becoming the next victim that came out. We saw that Symantec released the news about their investigation for teardrop and raindrop pieces of malware that they found in their customers. And then even today we saw, my Twitter feed has been inundated with the latest news about now Solar leaks, about code up for seal, which is a bit of a surprise, because then this kind of, to me, is it's likely a nation-backed group, not maybe necessarily a nation, state, actually direct operators. It kind of allows me to kind of maybe make that separation, because there is groups out there that some nation states will, ask them to do certain activities for them or campaigns, and they turn a blind eye to their profiteering and financial, criminal activities to do so forth. So based on the revelations that's coming out today, Terence, Jonathan, and Mike, I'd just like to get your thoughts, because it changes the motivation side of things for me. And it kind of raises to me that there's probably multiple groups involved, and this isn't a single group. It kind of raises that into that there's potentially we're dealing with multiple groups, maybe infrastructure, maybe malware developers, the actual execution payload campaign portion. I'm starting to see that the potential of multiple actors here working in tandem. Any thoughts are, based on the latest news around what we're seeing today?
So on the Malwarebytes, from what I understand, it's an old like Office 365 package that just happened to get hit. So I think that hopefully is more just like kind of collateral. Like it just happened, right? Like they said they didn't touch any production servers. I know the CEO was immediately on Reddit as soon as like that got posted. Like he was there. First comment was like, I'm here to answer questions. So hopefully they had some segmentation in their stuff, and it was kind of just this random app in the Microsoft ecosystem. But I think it's interesting, like how did like that app in the ecosystem, like if that's like came out of their app store and things like that, that's very, very interesting on how it was detected there, right? Like nobody else caught it, and it's running, and it's basically probably unfettered access to their email is what I'm assuming, if that's how it works. And I think it's going to start causing a lot of people to reevaluate that kind of stuff. I think Google's made some strides in that sort of thing, like their new like security heightened thing. I forget what the name they brand it as, but it basically blocks all third-party apps from accessing your Google data outside of like the core Google system things. I think that's what the Biden security team used this year. They used a physical key, and they basically locked it down so you couldn't connect it to any third-party system to sniff data. And so I think hopefully Microsoft's reevaluating these whole like marketplace apps type situation, right? Because I don't think you could feel comfortable allowing the customer to make the assumption like, yes, I want to allow this access to all my 365 data anymore. Like I think that's very difficult. Yeah.
I like the Apple approach in regard. I think Apple could be better, but I like their approach because they have a fully federated side of things. When you get into the Google and the marketplace and even the Microsoft App Store right now, it's the Wild West of plugins, even browsers. I get so scared of putting a browser extension in place. I have to spend like hours of research watching and monitoring of what it's doing before I even get to trust it. So, Terence, I'd like to get your thoughts on that side of things as well.
Yeah, and then kind of piggyback on what Jonathan said, another layer of defense is, we block OAuth apps just to that point. Everybody's tried to make it a seamless end user experience for adding apps, but again, your end users aren't going to read what they're granting access to in your environment. Does this, app that I'm using to draw diagrams need full read access to my email inbox? Probably not.
But I need this app and I need it now.
Exactly. That's the mindset, but you have to put some guardrails and control, around that. But the solar leaks thing, I agree with you, Joe, that it appears to be a group, behind a nation state. But FireEye released a report yesterday and a new tool set to scan, your AD environment. Yeah. So if I had, a recommendation for folks, use the tools that have been made available, whether it was through CISA or FireEye, to know your exposure, to know if you have any of these underlying issues or configurations in your environment, and plug the gap as fast as you can. Use microsegmentation, least privilege. At least make it difficult for them, because they may move on to another target. And I know that sounds bad, but it's like the analogy of a house with an alarm sitting next to the house that doesn't have an alarm. If I have a sign in the yard, he might, okay, I'm going over here to the house that doesn't have the sign in the yard because I don't think they have an alarm. So,
I think it's.
That's why I stole my neighbor's sign.
All your neighbor's signs are in your.
But I mean, I think on the back to that app thing, Terence, that you were talking about. I think as CISO, my role is not to say no. It's to find a way to yes. And I'm having this conversation actively with someone who wants to use this third-party software. It seems like it's going to really help our sales team, right? But it's requesting a level of access to our G Suite that we just don't give to anything, let alone something that's like seems pretty minor, like we can get along without. And so the discussion isn't, no, we can't do that. The discussion is, all right, what's this tool trying to solve? What problem are we trying to solve? And can we find one that meets your needs, that requires the right level of access and doesn't require this like, just give us the keys to the castle and trust us. Like level of access. I don't care how much I trust you. Yeah. Like the fact is, you don't need this access. Why should I give it to you?
Right. Yeah. Right. But to that point, that's a valid use case. But when random trial sites, somebody's just trying to demo something, or even some of the news sites nowadays, they'll give you the option to sign in with your Microsoft account, sign in with your Google account. And some of the access that these websites want to your email is just, there's no valid business justification for,
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between authenticate, right? Just sign in with versus, and then also give us access to.
And this is the problem, Terence, to your point, the problem with that is it's not managed. It's unfederated access. Even after you finish the trial, you've actually given it that application, basically authentication, that OAuth in the background where it allows you to communicate even after you may have finished the trial. So you're even exposing yourself to that data sharing long after you probably even remember that, who goes in and manages those? Who actually goes in and disables them after trials and so forth? So this gets a major challenge. And really, it's for me, it's a big concern.
It's an easy fix if they start putting time limits on the OAuth token.
Yes,
right. Like
yes, that's
Google can flip that switch tomorrow.
Yep.
Right.
I would love for that to happen.
15 minutes. This is what you get, and then it's like, cool. I have to reevaluate, kind of like Apple does with the location services, right? Like when it first on your iPhone, when it first asks, it just says, "Oh yeah, let them have access to the app." Like. Right
15
now.
days, 30 days.
And then it
but then it
waits
no longer than a year.
Yeah, and then it waits a couple times before you come back in, and then it's like, oh, do you want to continue allowing this, or should we block it? And I think like that kind of approach where it comes back later and asks is an interesting play. Yeah,
absolutely. And so one thing that for those right now, the victims out there, all these companies, not even just the customers of SolarWinds, but even the customers of those customers. Is now potentially one thing that I got used to years ago was into this process of every now and again changing your locks of the door. And for me, is this a time where many companies should really consider going in and migrating to new domain accounts, taking their domain administrator account, disabling them, and moving to new ones, rotating credentials? Is this a time? I mean, I think this is a pivot time in the industry where we really need to make it difficult and not make it easy. And this means that sometimes we have to look at disabling the renewing the Kerberos tickets, making sure that all accounts have been logged out of systems, maybe even reboots of systems, and moving, not necessarily, changing user accounts, but those domain credentials and domain administrators that are shared. Maybe this is a time where we really need to go in and proactively move to new accounts, and then monitor those accounts for, potential malicious activity. So.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what the government has to do, right? Like there's a lot of reports that are like the only way the government's going to know this stuff's out of their network is to completely rebuild their networks.
Yeah.
I that sounds great, right? From like sitting back watching this happen, but like that group's life for the next 3-4 years, done, right? Yeah. Like there's no new initiatives, there's no new anything. Like he's wiping everything, and I think. Yeah. That's going to cause some emotional problems for a lot of those people. On that
absolutely, the instant response for a domain administrator account being compromised is to rebuild directory. You cannot continue with your existing compromised systems. It's a rebuild, and we can go through all the different scenarios. But all those companies that have had those, SAML forgeries, that have had their certificates been compromised, that had their accounts been compromised. The realistic approach, and I've been helping a company respond to a ransomware case over the holidays. And it's a rebuild. There's no taking what you have and continuing. And this, this is where automation is crucial. If you've got automation, great, because you can do that much quicker. But yeah, right now, we're probably in a moment in time where many companies will have to rebuild from scratch.
I think that's a great opportunity to do that, to add this automation in now, right? Like in the past, there's been there's always this resistance to change or doing things like, but if you're going to be doing it anyway, now's the right time to go ahead and embrace the new ways of doing things and do more automation and figure out ways to do that.
And I think the biggest thing that we overlook when we talk about the automation part, it remembers everything, right? Like you're not going to remember every security setting you set 2 years ago. And so by putting it in code and automating it, it's like, oh, cool, it's automatically applied. Like I don't have to relearn these hard lessons that I forgot. Especially when it comes to security, because, something 2 years ago, like I probably don't remember, I don't remember why I set that setting, and I wouldn't have remembered if I manually built it this time.
And the cool thing is you can even leave a comment as to why you did it.
I do that all the time.
Post-it notes everywhere.
Because I'll put in CVE numbers, right? Like if it doesn't make sense why I set a setting a specific way, like I'll throw a CVE number in that comment so that as I'm reading it later, it's for me.
It's the best way. So I'd like to kind of, let's kind of close it up and kind of, because this is going to, we might be talking about this in 2 weeks. We might be talking about this in 2 years. This is going to be going on for a long time. I'm just for me, this is a wake up call. I think, it's a big wake up call for the industry. And I think this is, I think really, Brad Smith's comments at the CES trade show, I think that's the pivotal, the realization that we really need to see. This is an attack in the entire industry. And for me, I think, my lessons I've got from this is that, I very seldom use the term sophisticated. I can, analyze lots of malware. I look at lots of incidents, throughout my career. And this is up there probably in the top 5 I've had to deal with. This is significant that, the patience, the skill set that was involved for me. This really shows that cyber criminals, and nation states are taking their game to a much higher level. I'd like to get, all of your thoughts. What is this? What is the realization? What's your kind of overall takeaway from this? what would you what have you learned from this recent incident? So Jonathan, let's kick it off with you.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing that's going to kind of come out of this is the thing that everybody's kind of been just dragging their feet on the last couple of years is kind of that like reputation around your whole dependency management and supply chain. If it's, that kind of software and things like that, I think it's going to start to get those things start coming. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a bunch of companies now trying to do that kind of reputation based on, it's difficult with like a SolarWinds product because it's that, but like hopefully SolarWinds uses it if they're using like open source and things like that, and they can start to kind of score and say, hey, this package that you have in your thing had one brand new committer this month with like one change that he threw in here and threw into 30 other repositories with a brand new GitHub account, right? Like, I think those type of things just kind of brings more like risk scoring, enables you to kind of tweak these models and make them that much more powerful. Because I think at the end of the day, AI and ML, the best thing that's going to come out of that for the next, I think, 20 years is it's just eliminating a lot of the noise. You still need a human sitting there kind of making these calls, but like eliminating that noise frees you up to do other like spelunking in your network and finding these like unique things that are happening. And I think we're gonna continue on that with AI and ML for at least the next 20 years until they get like super smart. So
assisted intelligence, or augmented intelligence. Terence, what have you learned from this? What will you change going forward?
An increased focus on risk management, particularly, third parties and, your supply chain. But I think this allows us to have better conversations with those critical vendors and suppliers. Looking at your log aggregation strategies and micro segmentation, you can't detect what you don't know exists. So it's back to the whole shadow IT component sometimes of making sure you have up-to-date asset and software inventories, in your environment, and really training. At the end of the day, this is a human detected this, and like Jonathan said, we're just going to need an increased focus of eyes on glass. But alert fatigue, I've talked about this before, is real. It has to be manageable. So I think the technology will evolve to the point to where we're not boiling the ocean, and we will get a manageable amount of intel to act upon. But it's just really a lot of it's just holding on for the ride. But that defense in depth approach. But this is all an exercise in risk management at the end of the day. So just making sure that your capabilities are evolving and not stagnant and not static. And you have to be able, like we've said it a couple of times, pivot. You have to be able to pivot on a dime oftentimes because, our environments and our worlds change literally every day. One day it was like, we're evaluating cybersecurity now. Was this before or after SolarWinds? Like,
I feel like
SolarWinds after SolarWinds.
I feel it's like as if like aliens landed, right? All of a sudden our whole worldview would change if, if we learned that aliens actually, were visiting the planet.
Are they not already here?
I don't want to. I was nervous about making the analogy.
So, Mike, what have you learned from even today's discussion, or even from what you've been reading in the past?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, everything that Jonathan and Terence said, I think, and you, Joe, all applies, right? I think there's all the stuff that we can do, but one of the things, and Terence touched on a little bit, but I think this gives us an opportunity to really talk to the rest of the organization and use it as examples of why we do what we do, or to use like that one person who was like, hey. At FireEye, who was like, hey, there's this thing that's happening. I feel like this is weird that it's asking about this MFA. Why is it, whatever? Like, let's celebrate that person. Let's use that as an example of like, hey, somebody brought this to the forefront. Somebody reported this. That's the right thing to do. And use those positive examples that come out of this to really reinforce what we want out of the security and depth includes everybody at the company. And this is what we're talking about. And this is how this is a great example of how this works to prevent further problems. I think that's one of them. I think, I'm really interested to see the attribution and how this all goes. Yeah. Was it a nation state? I think there's no question that it has to be nation state backed. Was it? How was that done, and why? I think I just find fascinating. It's not going to like change my day to day, but at the same time, like, you know, Joe, you're saying like because of the profiteering aspect, it can possibly be this like company that this nation state knows about, but doesn't necessarily like do anything, or maybe they're supported. But then I think about even in the US, there's laws that allow police departments to profit off of pulling people over and just confiscating their stuff and then selling it at auction. So it's completely conceivable that organization is 100% a government organization that funds itself, you know, in part through whatever tax dollars or whatever budget they get from the government, but also from whatever property they're able to seize and resell. Like if I was running a government agency, I would have no problem with like, hey, yeah, if you guys want to profiteer off of this, like in this state, if I'm that type of person who's already looking to, you know, run that type of an agency, I don't see why I would draw the line at profiteering off of what I found. I'm not saying I'm that person. I'm just putting myself in that role. I'm not a terrible person. I mean, I am, but
I think for me, the news today, what it does is it pivots me from this not being, you know, let's say an espionage attack. It changes it to being criminal. That's the different. That's the separation I have, is that when you bring a monetary, financial, you know, fraud and profit out of it, that's what changes it from basically an intelligence gathering, espionage type of activity to profiteering, which is a criminal activity. And I think then that's where we get into the criminality side of things and holding countries against criminal intentions. You know, so this is the difference for me. Is where that crossover is starting to occur. Is to start getting into that criminal side of things. So it's been awesome. It's been awesome having you all on the panel and the show today. This is great, and I think it's a timely discussion. I think this is one that will definitely change our industry going forward. You know, listening to your views, and I think our audience are definitely going to get a lot of value. I'm really excited to even share with our audience is that we've literally hit over 10,000 listens of our episodes. We launched this back in May of last year. And we continue to have the episode every 2 weeks. So if you're interested in listening to more, we've had some awesome guests to date, and we've got some really exciting ones still coming forward. So that's due to be released. So we're excited about the show. We're excited to have our amazing audience listen to our views and sometimes ramblings, because we can go on for hours. This show could be, you know, 5, 10. It can be a complete series of, you know, one show where we just cut it into different episodes. But I, you know, really glad the value that our audience are getting from our special guests that we have on, you know, definitely subscribe to the show. You know, get the updates. You know, go back and listen to older episodes. You know, we've had some fantastic guests on, like Josh Lasmanoso. We had Jessica Ada, and we've had, you know, great guests. Sterling Government's been on. So if you're interested in going back, listen to our older episodes, and we'll make sure to keep you up to date on the latest news. And, you know, many thanks for listening in. So, you know, awesome, Mike, Terence, Jonathan. It's always great to have you on. And hopefully this won't be the last time you're on. We'll always try and grab you back on for later episodes. So out there, you know, stay safe. Listen to us. Subscribe to the show. Joe Carson from 401 Access Tonight. Mike, any last words?
Nope, that's it. Great show.
Okay, take it away. Thank you, everyone, and talk to you soon. Take care.